Welcome to another episode of This Is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast. Season 5, Episode 27. Your safe space to discuss sports, politics, social issues, and even religion, where we will take it all very seriously, but not too seriously. I didn't like using the term Build Back Better for the Biden bill, and I don't like using the big beautiful bill either, but it's just easier to say those stupid ass names than to try to describe the legislation that's being passed, I believe as I utter this, through the Senate to go back to the House for reconciliation. I'm going to do a piece about the big beautiful bill. Thank you to my loyal listeners. I do appreciate you. If you're new to the podcast, please like, subscribe, thumbs up, 5-star, write a review, send to friends and enemies far and wide. This Is Why I Don't Vote podcast is on Patreon. If you like what you hear and you want to keep it ad-free, please consider supporting.
Act 1. The new legislation that Trump is pushing is more kicking the can down the road.
The Senate just passed their version of this new legislation that Trump is pushing, which is basically major tax cuts for the wealthy in the United States, additional funding for the military and for ICE to further carry out Trump's deportation policy. And it also guts all of the incentives that were provided in that Biden bill that was passed for what I think most people would call green energy or new energy. And Trump calls this the big beautiful bill, and Biden called his legislation Build Back Better. It's curious to me that Trump uses the same kind of moniker that Biden did to label his bill. It's almost as if he has to one-up Biden by using that same kind of BBB, that acronym, which is stupid as hell. I didn't call the Biden legislation Build Back Better because I thought that was stupid as hell. So I'm certainly not going to call this the big beautiful bill. It certainly is big, and it's questionable whether or not it's beautiful. I've discussed my political leanings on this podcast numerous times. I grew up more a conservative, certainly more of a Republican than I was a Democrat. But it doesn't matter which political party. Again, I've said that the political parties have morphed into one another. They've merged, which is essentially true. And I am not going to harp on that point specific to this legislation. What I do want to harp on, as someone who came from the right and is now more an independent, doesn't believe in either one of the parties. You have heard, I have heard for years on end. Let's harken back to 1996 with the Republican wave that swept out the Democrats in the House of Representatives after they had controlled it for close to 40 years, or maybe it was over 40 years. The Republican Party had embraced for years and has a number of very powerful interest groups as a part of its coalition that believe in fiscal responsibility, or at least they purport to believe in fiscal responsibility. So getting the budget under a certain number, getting the budget under control, using language like that had been important. No new taxes and cutting what entitlements existed that would increase the federal budget. And what you saw starting in the mid-90s was this messaging about how we're going to cut taxes, but we're going to spend money in certain segments of the economy, and the government is going to be the catalyst of that. And you think to yourself, well, if we're cutting taxes and we're spending more money, that's going to increase the deficit. But lo and behold, those tax cuts, plus where the money is being spent, is going to prompt such a growth spurt in the economy that any potential deficit is going to be made up by this growth, and there won't be any net long-term deficit specific to these tax cuts. Here we are now 30 years later, and we've seen the consequences of that type of messaging, of that type of policy, of that type of belief system. It's complete and total bullshit. The deficit has skyrocketed under both Democratic and Republican administrations. Both parties, when they are in power, are looking to cut as many taxes to corporations and to the wealthy as they can, and they are looking to redirect and spend as much money in certain segments of the economy as they can. So they are both spending more money, both parties spending more money, and at the same time trying to reduce the amount of revenue that the government is bringing in vis-a-vis tax cuts. I just made reference to that Build Back Better bill, and I want you to think about it, dear listener. There were some tax increases in that bill for certain sectors of the U.S. economy, but the tax cuts that Trump had enacted in 2017, they were still in effect. It wasn't like that bill, that legislation, wiped out those tax cuts. All Trump is doing now with this new legislation is extending the tax cuts that were set to expire from 2017. In addition to extending those tax cuts, we are increasing the money that's going to the military, to the Pentagon, so that now we're spending over $1 trillion, $1 trillion a year on military spending, on the Pentagon, a government agency that has never passed a full audit. In addition, we're basically gutting all of the new energy proposals that have been passed not only by the Biden administration, but also from the Obama administration. I read an article, dear listener, that there is now money being reallocated into ethanol development. Remember ethanol? Remember the Bush administration pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into ethanol? And I believe over the course of the Bush administration, they spent something like $50 billion. And that may not be the right number. I'm not going to look it up. But it was billions and billions of dollars over the course of the 8 years that George Bush was in power and the White House. This government propped up ethanol production as a fuel source, and it went nowhere. You can't find an ethanol station to put ethanol into any damn thing in this country. And the Trump administration's new legislation is going to redirect money back into ethanol. Why? It's just a giveaway to these major corporations that are so invested in corn in this country. Two major takeaways that have been discussed on the news but have not been messaged very well by the opposing party, the Democrats, which leads me to believe that although they want to feign resistance, that their donors also want this bill to be passed, and there's only so much lip service that they can give to the media or the American public because the powers that be want this bill passed. First and foremost, is it going to skyrocket, balloon the current deficit? You're damn straight it is. It's going to add at least another $5 trillion to the deficit. This $3 trillion number that's being batted around, think about it. When has the government ever been right about its projections on deficits, on how much any piece of legislation is going to add to the deficit? The numbers that I've read that seem most reasonable to me is $5 trillion added to the deficit. Now, there's people who will argue that who cares? Who cares now what the deficit is? But the fact of the matter is the United States is sitting in this top position in the world economy because everything runs on the dollar. And the day that the dollar is not what people use to trade in oil, to trade in currencies, the deficit's going to be a big fucking deal. And I don't mind engaging in a little ageism here. The baby boomers, since they have taken the reins of power, starting with Bill Clinton in the early 90s, have skyrocketed the deficit, such that we may never as a nation be able to get out from under that burden. And who's it going to be? Is it going to be the baby boomers? No, they're going to be dead. When all of those bills come due, the boomers will be dead. So there'll be some people. And I think it's going to help the middle class. When I say people, there's going to be some people in the top 1%, but there are going to be people who are in the top 10% and maybe the top 25% of earners in this country who are going to benefit from this tax cut. There may be a lot of people who work in certain sectors that you might call blue collar or mid-level white collar work that are going to benefit from this legislation. But this is not long-term thinking. You're going to put a little money in people's pockets today, and the economy may reflect that people are less worried about the future and they have a few more dollars in their pocket, but at what cost? Another $5 trillion added to the deficit in the next 10 years. The second thing I wanted to talk about was this contrast or this contradiction in what this bill is trying to do versus all of this bullshit that we've been fed about AI and how important it is. Artificial intelligence and cloud computing in general take up a shitload of electricity. This cryptocurrency market takes up a shitload of electricity. If this is the future, then you would expect every piece of legislation that any administration passes for the next 15, 20, 25 years, it's going to have some kind of energy provision. It's going to try and account for the additional electricity that's going to be needed in order to compete in an international market with what? With AI, cloud computing, and cryptocurrency. This bill guts energy in this country probably like no other bill has ever done so. I don't give a shit how anybody feels politically about battery technology, about solar technology, or about wind technology. I just don't care. If you want to gut those technologies, so be it. But you have to then account for how are we going to produce additional energy? How are we going to make up for what we're going to lose if we are no longer competitive in those markets? And you don't see any kind of solution in this legislation. Pouring money back into 17th century energy technologies, oil and natural gas, that's not the solution. I believe it was Elon Musk that pointed out this chart, but I've seen it used in other articles talking about this legislation, that by the year 2030, China is going to produce as much energy in battery technology, solar technology, and wind technology that the United States produces in aggregate. Think about that, dear listener. All of the energy that's used in this country, China will be able to produce that amount of energy with batteries, with solar, with wind. In an environment where you're hearing all these tech dorks and all these politicians scream about how we need to be investing in AI, we need to be investing in the future of these technologies, how nearsighted is it that we're going to gut the energy source that's going to fuel these technologies rather than try to increase our energy production? Look, I don't give a shit if it's nuclear. If we saw proposals that there's going to be 6, 8, 10 new nuclear plants built around this country to make up for this deficit, we're not going the way of batteries. We're not going the way of wind or solar. We're going to go back to nuclear. Okay, it presents a whole different set of problems, but it is a solution to the fact that we need more energy and we're not investing in it. Who will bear the brunt of the burden of the fact that we don't have enough energy? I don't think it's going to be urban areas. When you have this power drain from AI, from cloud computing, from cryptocurrency, who do you think is going to suffer because there's not enough energy to go around? It's going to be people in rural areas where energy is already a loss leader. If you live in a rural area and you have an energy bill that is anywhere close to my energy bill, the energy company is losing money on your house. It simply costs more to distribute power to a rural area than it does an urban area. And if there is a power drain, where do you think that lack of energy is going to be realized first? It's going to be rolling blackouts in rural areas. Now, here's the most hilarious part about all of this. People are talking about the fact that there's going to be a number of current Medicaid recipients that are going to be kicked off the program. I'm not really going to go into that, but I believe it's going to be true. Those are going to be most likely people in densely packed urban areas, but also rural areas. Without that Medicaid money, many rural hospitals are going to go under. They're operating at razor-thin margins as it is. Rural hospitals rely on government subsidies just to make the ends meet, to stay in the black, to keep the lights on. Without that money, many of them are going to go under. And you're on top of that, which is being less discussed, you're going to have rolling blackouts in these rural areas. So you're going to have people who don't have access to any healthcare within, let's say, a 30 to 40 minute drive of where they live. and they are also going to suffer from power outages. Who did these rural people vote for? They voted for Donald Trump. It's not unique to either party. These administrations often betray their base. They simply need the votes, and they're going to say what they need to say in order to get them, and then they both the Republicans and the Democrats serve the same masters. Two things are very possibly going to happen when this bill passes. One, there may be a boost in the economy because, again, a number of different stakeholders are going to benefit from these tax cuts. But you're also going to see a significant amount of the Trump base suffer because of these tax cuts. And this country, in the long run, is very likely going to suffer because of it. Is it possible that this would hearken the Democrats retaking the House and maybe even the Senate in the midterm elections next year? Maybe. But frankly, dear listener, who gives a shit if it does result in the Democrats taking back the House and the Senate? What's going to change? Ultimately, what's going to change? This is Why Don't Vote, a podcast.